Hello, everybody. Let me just get this set up. Click here. Um, Welcome, and thank you for joining us today in this virtual gathering space as we kick off the Bugs and Beasts Colloquium. My name is Nina Bezichnik, and I'm a curator at the Henry Art Gallery at the University of Washington in Seattle. And my colleague, Mita Mahato, Associate Curator of Public and Youth Programs, and Carolyn Pinedo-Ternovsky, Associate Professor of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington, organized this colloquium as a space to imagine and explore possibilities for survival and liberation for those whose protections are limited or whose personhood is compromised, oppressed, or threatened within socio-legal systems. Over the course of the colloquium, which includes events throughout the fall and winter quarters, University of Washington faculty and graduate student discussants from a variety of disciplines, as well as invited guest scholars and artists, will interrogate how the question of which bodies have equal protections and rights under the law continues to be contested, but has the possibility to be reimagined through the creative tools shared by scholarly, artistic, and pedagogic practices. The colloquium takes its name from an inspiration from the Henry's upcoming presentation of the experimental essay film Bugs and Beasts Before the Law by Bam Bitchell, the artistic collaboration of Alexis Kyle Mitchell and Charlene Bambit. The film, which will be on view at the Henry in early 2021, explores the history and legacy of the animal trials that took place across medieval and early modern Europe and its colonies in the Americas, in which non-human animals and inanimate objects were put on trial for various crimes and offenses, ranging from trespassery and thievery to assault and murder. Ben Bitchell's film animates how power is performed through the body of the other, revealing the ways authorities and institutions mediate social relations and subjecthood through such processes as the formation of property and the criminality of sexual difference, themes that remain all too relevant today. And we're happy to have Charlene and Alexis here with us as attendees at today's roundtable, and who may jump in and participate once we get to our question and answer section of today's presentation. And also keep an eye out for their performance lecture, which is scheduled, or which will be scheduled later in 2021 as part of the overall colloquium calendar of events. Before introductions to today's participants in the roundtable, I would like to make a few notes of acknowledgement and gratitude. As you may know, it's important that we do a land acknowledgement, and we've instituted this as a practice at the Henry a few years ago. The land acknowledgement is an opportunity for us to acknowledge that we at the Henry and at the University of Washington live and work on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples and the shared waters of all tribes and bands, named and unnamed, including Squamish, Duwamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. The land acknowledgement reminds us of our connections and indebtedness to the peoples and the more than human kin where we live and work. And we pay respects to elders past and present. The Bugs and Beasts Colloquium is supported by the Simpson Center for the Humanities, and we want to thank Kathleen Woodward, Rachel Artiega, Caitlin Palo, and the whole Simpson Center staff for their support. And also, I believe we're having closed captioning today, and I'd like to thank our closed captioning person, Myra Perez. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Ian Sapuran, who's doing all the back-end technology today, and we're super grateful for all of his attention to detail. So today's roundtable addresses the question, is justice a process or an outcome? And our speakers are going to address this question through the lens of their own research and engage in dialogue for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll follow the discussion by question and answer. And we encourage you to add your questions and comments in the chat at any time during the program, and we'll try to come back to them at the end. Today's conversation is moderated by Dr. Sarah Keenan, who joins us from the Birkbeck Law School at the University of London, where she co-directs the Center for Research on Race and Law. Her research and teaching are at the intersection of legal and political theory, geography, and postcolonial studies. Her monograph, Subversive Property Law and the Production of Spaces and Belonging, was published in the Routledge Social Justice Series in 2015. She has recently completed a Leverhulme Fellowship on her current project, Making Land Liquid, the Temporality of Title Registration. Dr. Keenan is joined in conversation by Dr. Chandan Reddy, who is Associate Professor in the Departments of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies and the Comparative History of Ideas at the University of Washington, Seattle, and Dr. Christopher J. Schell, Assistant Professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Dr. Reddy is co-editor with Jody Beard, Alyosha Goldstein, and Jody Melamede of the special issue of Social Text, Economies of Dispossession, Indigeneity, Race, and Capitalism, published in spring 2018. And he is the author of the book, Freedom with Violence, Race, Sexuality, and the U.S. State, published by Duke University Press in 2011. He is currently at work on a new book project titled Administrating Racial Capitalism. Dr. Schell is an urban ecologist whose research seeks to understand how urban wildlife, specifically coyotes and raccoons, adjust to life in urban environments. Dr. Schell's work infuses the natural sciences with urban studies and critical race theory, and his lab spotlights the need to promote justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in conservation and environmental movements, to amplify environmental equity and civil rights, and to directly address the need to lead climate crises and sustainability efforts with justice. I'm going to hand it over to today's speakers, and please join me in a virtual applause.
Thanks so much, Nina, yeah, thanks to everyone at the Henry and on the panel with us here today. It's great to be involved in these virtual events. So today, the question that we're responding to is justice a process or an outcome? And what we thought we'd do is we'll start, each of us have written short essays responding to the question, and we'll just start by really briefly talking to those essays on the assumption that probably most people haven't read them. So firstly, I want to say that actually I found this question so difficult to respond to. I think because for me, maybe at all times, but particularly at this time, justice, the very concept of justice, feels like such an impossible concept to think about. So I kind of avoided the question, I think, and instead I've reflected, being a legal scholar, I guess I think mainly about the injustice created by law. And so I've reflected on what law does in terms of producing space and time, how it orients us in particular directions and determines the conditions on which we relate to each other and to our physical environment or our non-human environment. And because of the framing of the question of thinking about processes and outcomes caused me to think about time and the temporal framing of concepts like justice. Do they go on forever, or can they ever be achieved as an event? And also, I think, thinking about this question in relation to Bam Bitchell's film, I wanted to challenge this idea of law as outside of time and space and jumping in the courtroom or in the uniform of police to deliver justice as and when it's called upon. So I think what I write about is that I think it's important to understand that law doesn't exist outside of time and space. It determines the time and space that we are allowed to occupy in the world. premature death through police killing and deportations are the most extreme examples of this. The terms of our student loans and rental agreements are also more benign everyday instances of this legal power. So making these contracts, these binding promises to keep paying and therefore to keep behaving in a particular way produces a particular future for those of us who've signed them. And it's not a future where pending ecological catastrophe, for example, is our key concern, and nor are meaningful relationships with people we love, let alone with strangers. Instead, we're categorized into populations and taught to fear each other. So while we're sold the line that law exists outside of time and space and intervenes to deliver justice, so much is already predetermined, like the conditions of our student loans and of citizenship, and also like the theft of land in settler colonial contexts. These questions already seem to be answered before we've ever begun. So yeah, so for me to even start to begin imagining justice would require us to radically reevaluate who and what we have obligations to, and from there to relate to each other and to the non-human world differently. Chandan, would you like to speak to your piece?
Sure. Thank you very much. First, I just wanted to also do a few thank yous and acknowledgements. And the first, I want to just thank Mita Mihato. Mita is one of the most gracious people I've worked with in trying to get me to get my stuff together in absolute kindness and awareness of the moment we're in. So I just really want to appreciate her unique presence. And I also want to thank the artists, of course. Their work has just been so rich and stimulating for me. And I can't think of a more apt time to be in relationship to their work and to be a viewer of it, to experience it. And I'm saddened that we're not all together physically, but I'm pleased that we have these other means of engagement. And of course, I want to thank Sarah and Chris for being in dialogue today. I like Sarah, the question of what is justice, and is it a process or is it an outcome, or in other words, does it have a content or is it a mode of practice by which it's achieved, arrived at? Those are, I think, very important questions. But they also, to some degree, are questions that may no longer be the questions we need to ask. And maybe that is a kind of justice, if you want to put it that way. And so for the piece that I wrote, I wanted to ask the question of what moment are we in? To ask the question of justice, of course, is as Sarah was just saying, first to orient yourself, to put yourself in a time and a place. And the question of what is our moment now, what is this time that we're in, is perhaps one that none of us really know definitively. We couldn't be in a more tumultuous historical moment. But the now does afford us some opportunities to think about how we arrived here, and what work we might need to do to think about moving forward, if not necessarily in a future, at least in an engagement with the present. And so the piece that I wrote begins by thinking, and Chris's piece really addresses this. We are in a moment in which we cannot go back to the past. A lot of the work that Zoom is doing in our lives is to try to convince us that we can take our previous lives and use technology and adaptively return to them in this strange interregnum that we're in, that will be solved by biomedicine and a vaccine, and then we'll return to the lives that we once had. And that's the kind of narrative that we really have to reject for ourselves, and that we have to work every day to deny, because everything in a capitalist society and in US society, and I'm sure this is true in London as well, where Sarah is organized to make us believe that resumption is the goal of this period. And in many ways, what this period allows us to do is to interrogate that desire for normalcy, and to try to think about why we want to return to the normal, if the normal is what got us here. What is it about normalcy that is so compelling, that despite all evidence otherwise, that it has been a catastrophe that we're now living through, we still desire this resumption. And I think some of this is the promise of progress that we think the resumption of the prior time puts us on. And that is that belief in progress, that once we get back to normal time, we're going to be moving towards a better world, a better vision of justice, that we're going to be cleaning up prior justice and making it whole for everyone. I think that's exactly what the artists are trying to interrupt. And Bugs and Beasts is this absolutely brilliant piece about the ways in which law possesses within itself all kinds of mystical ideas and beliefs. It's not secular. It is not scientific. It is not founded on reason. It is founded on the capriciousness and oftentimes the malignant pleasures of beings. In Anglo-American law, that's humans, and in prior forms of law, like Roman law, that could be mystical beings as well as gods. You know, they give us these great examples of trials that animals were put on, and this I think is really fascinating, that you can. So, for example, they give you the one that I really love is termites that were put to trial because they were eating the building that friars were living in. And of course, the Pope was very upset that the friars were ruining this building, and the friars were very upset that the termites were ruining the building. And so they had a very spirited trial, putting the termites on trial for their wickedness, and the defense of the termites was very spirited, and the defendants, the lawyer for the termites said, look, these are incredibly industrious termites. They're working hard every day, biting all this wood and eating up this structure, whereas the friars are just sitting there and doing nothing, you know, praying. So if anything, they should be not put on trial, but celebrated, and this case should be dismissed. And of course, as good as that argument was, they were found guilty. But what it shows, I mean, and I'll say this as an aside, just yesterday in the paper, we read that over 560 migrant children are now in in ICE custody without their parents, without the knowledge of where their parents are to return the children. So, so the United States is able now to conduct forms of justice and law that don't even offer the kinds of trials that termites were given. And these are kinds of questions that we need to ask. In the Anglo-American world, when slavery founded these lands, the law of Deodan was another instance in which enslaved people could be found persons for the matter of criminal liability. So if they killed their slave master, when, for example, when they were being raped, as one famous case exists, They could be found criminally liable, but they didn't have civil personalities, so they couldn't claim freedom, for example. So there are all of these kinds of mystical logics in the law, all of these malignant logics in the law that remind us that the law is not reason, that our time is not one that's moving towards progress, but rather that we live in a time governed by the divisions of law, and that our task might be to imagine what the effects of those divisions have been and how we might live past them or beyond them. And so in my piece, I tried to think about living beyond justice. Justice is ultimately a very human-centric concept. I give the example in the Northwest of orcas and caribous. You cannot demand justice for orcas and caribous. You could possibly find them guilty, as termites were found guilty, as the orcas are found guilty by the US Navy that needs to use the waters for its sonic testing. But they cannot themselves get justice. So in the climate catastrophe, justice is an inadequate concept to understand the role of human impact on now what's going to be 1 million species that will be extinct by the end of the year. Secondly, I think that justice is not what the contemporary movements for change are about. The contemporary movements for change, and I talk about Decriminalize Seattle, and I'm happy to talk about it further, or King County Equity Now, or the indigenous movements that were once denied residence in Seattle and now are allowed to be residents as the predominant homeless population of the city. That what we see in these instances is that they're not working for social justice. They're working to repair the violence of the law. And that maybe what we need to do is not think about justice, but to start thinking about the work of repair. And why don't I stop there? Sorry for taking up some time.
No, not at all. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jonathan, Sarah, thank you both. I'm superbly honored and humbled to share this Zoom stage with you all, as well as everybody who has been able to put this together, and all of you that are on this call. For me, I come in from the lens of an ecologist, right? And ecology at its base understanding and definition is the relationship of organisms to other organisms in their environment. And in thinking about that and thinking what normalcy even means, it very much is interesting to consider the conversation about justice as a process or an outcome. I very much think of it as a process, and one in which is very much under this umbrella of ecology, in the sense that justice is a form of energy and balance. So in my essay, I talk about the current context, and it should be noted, right? We're doing this Zoom session, we're doing this Zoom panel in the middle of what seems like chaos every single week. If somebody had written this down in a novel, you wouldn't believe it. It wouldn't get picked up because folks would say, there's no way in any possible universe that this would have all happened within a period of 10 months. And yet we sit here now thinking that what's going to drop this week? What's going to drop next week, right? We are less than 2 weeks away from this election and thinking very much about what the future is going to hold for us. So one of the things I oftentimes think about when I'm, say, for instance, trouncing around different parts of the city and seeing how animals navigate the city is seeing how we navigate our cities and what created those cities, and where does justice exist in that framework. So understanding, for instance, how those little brown birds you see, house sparrows, choose where they decide to live, or where, say, coyotes decide to create dens for themselves, where deer may decide to cross the road. It's very apropos that we're talking about bugs and beasts before the law, quite because of the fact that we oftentimes separate ourselves from those bugs and beasts, when in fact we are both the bugs and the beasts in many, many respects. So when thinking about justice, I oftentimes think about it as a process, because right now it feels like justice is completely absent, but it's not binary. It's not you have one or the other, but rather that we have to work towards it, right? You have to, if you want to see the fruits of your labor, we have to build the justice that we want to see and constantly be building it. And that has been superbly evident in the last 8 to 16 years, where If we have a lot of, say, turnout for an election, then we end up seeing more of the reforms that are inclusion and equitable across many different communities of peoples. And yet when we take a back seat, or when there are many policies put in place to essentially take the stance of not having justice be enacted in the system because of power imbalances and the power systems that aggregate power in a few hands, then you end up seeing justice kind of go by the wayside. It could be the same thing for any extinction level event, right? Wherever there is particular energy for one species over another, ultimately what ends up happening is that species tends to decline over time. So community ecology 101, right? There's this theory known as lac of Volterra, where essentially if you have predator and prey, they interact with each other. And if the predators get too high in population abundance, then you start to see the prey go down. So obviously, if the prey go down, you start to see the predators go down. Why? Because there aren't that many resources, AKA energy, right? If we don't have a lot of energy where certain groups of organisms are overruling the other organisms themselves, then that really depredates and deprecates the ability of all organisms to survive in a system. Why is that analogy important? Well, let's imagine that those that don't want justice, that enshrine injustice in laws and in policy, are the ones that gain the majority of the power. This is really important because over time in those models, if they increase at a certain level, everybody else who is trying to work towards and put energy in a system of justice will eventually go locally extinct. So too will all of the others. So we all rely on each other. And that's not just humans, right? That's the natural world we live in. That's all non-human organisms as well. And as I highlight in my piece, the injustices that we enact on each other are also injustices that we enact on our natural world. Chandan just brought this up. We are losing millions of species within just a century. Imagine what the next century is going to look like. I think about that constantly with my 2- and 4-year-old, and think about what world are they going to live in when they're my age? What world are they going to inherit when they are the ones who have to make the decisions for how we enact justice in our natural world? It is a sense of equilibrium that we need to gain. And, you know, if I can conclude at least my section, I oftentimes think about this in the lens of a pop culture reference. Some of y'all probably have seen or heard of Avatar: The Last Airbender. If you have not, great show. Go watch it later. Korra is also excellent. But the point being is that the Avatar at one point has to think about balance and what that balance means for their chakras, and how putting yourself within and outside of the context of who you are and who the universe is and who your community is important for you to see that we are all part of this fabric and this framework. So creating imbalances by creating injustices more and more into the system means that that process of justice, which takes a whole lot of energy from an entire community, is completely disrupted to the point that you end up seeing everything dying. So life is inherently needing justice. It's needing balance. It's needing that energy. And we have that energy to provide it. However, the structures that are created to perpetuate those injustices also jeopardize the ability for life to exist. And that is something that we need to hold dear, is that under all of this, right, is the fact that we are fighting for our lives. And that fight is one in which it's a process. We don't just live and then we're all of a sudden alive. We struggle to live. Your cells right now are doing everything they possibly can to live. And especially for those that have contracted COVID, we are fighting to live every single day. We don't even think about it, but when you wake up and you breathe, right, that breath takes energy. Your ability to get up and walk takes energy. Being on this Zoom call takes energy. Justice is the same. It takes our energy and our efforts and our continual fight as a community and not individuals.
Thanks so much, Chris and Chandan. I mean, there's so much in what you've both just spoken about. I guess one theme that we could maybe think about is, Chris, when you talk about justice from this ecological perspective, I get this sort of I'm not sure if it's an optimistic or pessimistic view, but I mean, is extinction of the human species where if we are the power that is, taking too much, way too much energy right now with very material ecological consequences, what happens next? Like, is there a way to repair the Anthropocene, to sort of connect it to Chandan's framework of repair? Is there, is that possible, or is that something that that we can think about within? It's something that within law I can't think about. I don't have the tools to imagine that. But do either of you from your disciplines have the tools to imagine that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, briefly for me, I agree with you. I tend to lean towards the optimism spectrum, even in the darkest of times, and also try and divorce myself from being superbly anthropocentric. So I would like to think, and such is the case, despite some of the traditional views on environmentalism, that human beings can be really good for the environment. In fact, traditional ecological knowledge shows us that, right? So the ability to understand the forest and do prescribed burns using those traditional practices from many indigenous communities and tribes has kept many of those communities vibrant and thriving for a whole host of diverse species. And yet those practices have been wiped aside. So there is this social ecological dynamic that makes me very optimistic that we could get this right if we actually, in fact, listen to each other and lead with compassion. And all of that is scarce of late. So that seems really hard to get to. And yet I also think to myself, the planet in and of itself will move on if human beings aren't on this planet, right? So we are privileged to be on this planet, third from the sun, that has the ability to host life. We have been given that gift, and we have the ability to either accept the gift and be responsible for it, or to squander that gift and be gone. But rest assured, there are going to be other organisms that inhabit this planet way after we do, right? So certainly tardigrades are on the list, but many folks think of cockroaches and pigeons and raccoons, and they may thrive and they may speciate and give rise to many, many other new species, and that would be great too. It really is our choice in how we want to see what this future is going to look like, knowing full well that we need to trust in the fact that there's going to be change. So Sarah, you brought this really important point up earlier about time, right? And time and how important this is. I cannot imagine what 100 years is going to look like from now. But given the data that we have, and given the perspectives, whether it be from community activists all the way up to those in academic circles, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that if we did certain things here or there, we could get to a better future. But it just takes whatever that means for whoever is on this call and beyond to think about strategies and ways that puzzle it together rather than one strategy that solves everything. And that will not work. Chandan, what do you think?
It's a really good question. What I really loved about your piece, Chris, is I think that my piece ended by really trying to think about the fact that we just need new metaphors. We need new metaphors for guiding us and our practices. And we've lived with the metaphor of striving towards justice. And it's been a bit disastrous, despite the fact that people who have been violated by our rights-based society continue to fight and thrive and live, and I'm optimistic about those folks for sure. But I think that your idea that maybe, rather than thinking about justice, think ecology as the metaphor that we might use to guide ourselves is a really interesting proposition. And as Sarah says, this is where we might be entering into, this is what art does so well, is it brings nonsensical connections into sense, so what would it mean to bring ecology to the law and vice versa? Those are disciplines that could not be further from each other, but maybe we're at a moment where that needs to happen. So I think that, that's exciting to me. And that's possibly what the opportunity of this moment is. I do want to mention that, and I'd love to ask Sarah a question at the end of this, that my essay also mentions the Duwamish and the Suquamish peoples, and the fact that they were, the fifth ordinance of Seattle was to make sure that there were no Suquamish and Duwamish people inside the city limits of Seattle, and to make sure that they could never live in Seattle, and that they could only move through the city if they had the permission of an employer, a white employer. And I mentioned this because I think it's important to remember that the concept of law that we've inherited from Anglo-American society is one that has figured Native people as the danger to justice. That if we are to have any real system of justice, any real system of law, we must, the we here being Anglo-European societies, must have the right to wage war on Indigenous people who wage war on society. And so justice is a very, it is burdened with the blood that it has spilled. I think that when we move to thinking about ecology, we might have the opportunity to imagine other knowledges rather than the organization to which we're indebted through the law, to help us with our relations. And the question I had for Sarah was really about this question, which is, your piece spoke so eloquently about how we're in a moment where we're seeing an expansion of detention centers globally, not just detention in the US and Her Majesty's detentions in Australia, but in China, wherever you see it. And I was wondering if you could say something about how we reconcile ourselves to detention, why it is that we allow detention to persist, why the law allows detention to persist, even if individuals may find it abhorrent.
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I mean, I guess I'm most familiar with immigration detention and with juvenile detention in the Australian context. And of course, it's another word for prison, and it is a different kind of prison because people are incarcerated on a different legal basis, but the outcome is the same. The material conditions are the same. In the Australian context, I don't know how familiar you are, but Australia has, I would say, the most elaborate and cruel system of refugee detention in the world. I think because of its geography. It's an island in the South Pacific. It receives very few irregular migrants by boat, and it has a series of very strict laws where those irregular migrants are intercepted at sea and then taken to remote Pacific islands and detained there indefinitely. Many young men in particular have died on those islands, including one by self-immolation. And I think that in the Australian context, the only sort of form of detention that is comparable is the juvenile detention of overwhelmingly Aboriginal children who are detained at alarming levels to this day, and who are tortured in detention, and there's evidence of that. Why the Australian population doesn't just allow it, but actively supports these systems is I think goes back to a deep knowledge that the sovereignty of the Australian state is illegitimate, and that the white British society that has been established in Australia over the past 200 years, which is a very short period in that island continent's history, is there's no grounds for it. There's no legal grounds for it. I mean, I know that the treaties signed in North America are also spurious and have been breached, but in Australia, it was taken on the basis that Indigenous people were subhuman, essentially. I mean, there are a lot of legal contradictions, but there's not even a treaty that's been signed. So, I mean, legally, Australia is still at war with its Indigenous population because the land certainly hasn't been ceded. There's no treaty, and the idea of terra nullius has been rejected. So where does that leave you? It leaves you in a very, very fragile state of mind that I think causes you as a state, I guess, to act abhorrently on any kind of population that puts that entitlement to be there into question. I don't know if you both feel similarly about the US.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, given many of the plights of Black and Indigenous people of color in the Americas in particular, that one is fraught with its own history of real insidiousness. And Chandan had brought this point up, and very much I like this in the essay, was the concept of what justice is. We need to move away from the traditional Anglo, very settler colonialist view of what justice is. And that's particularly because justice in this current time of us wanting to return to normalcy, it should be noted, and a reminder for all of you, that normalcy meant that we were profiting off of cheap labor, that capitalism was profiting off of the backs of those that were the invisible for so long, and that we actively knew they were invisible and avoided that invisibility, right? So under the guise of justice, the cloak of justice was certainly something that was as far from it as you possibly could be. And yet knowing the concept of stolen peoples on stolen lands, right? So the history of the slave trade and the rebuke against the fact that systemic racism exists in our own government, as if, you know, as the White House has made announcements recently that racial sensitivity training should not be enshrined in federal institutions. Now, of course, many academic institutions in the US are starting to follow suit. Many universities are saying, all right, well, cool, we're not going to do any justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work anymore because the White House has said it's not necessary. That has certainly been something that's been repeated over and over and over again from constant laws. When folks say, well, slavery was so long ago, I like to remind them that, you know, there was right after slavery, the Southern Reconstruction, which led to many of the monuments to Confederates across the nation, not just in the South, but all across the nation, which was followed up by Jim Crow laws and redlining and urban renewal and white flight, which was followed up by mass incarceration. And now COVID has exacerbated and shown all of those foundational cracks, right? Quite literally, we have a pandemic that is ravaging the world. It's ravaging us perhaps the most savagely, and the proportion of folks that are Black and brown that are being disproportionately impacted is much greater than it is for those that are not Black and brown. And that is given our very brief history, right? So Sarah, you just brought up 200 years, right? All of this that I just mentioned happened in 150 years. I have a grandfather who grew up in the Jim Crow South in Athens, Georgia. You know, so I'm not that far removed from many of the policies that were instated to essentially shirk justice altogether, which is so ironic because we call the justice system, you know, we have justice at the beginning and then it is not. It is not just. So I like to think that those that have been oppressed in the United States are actually working towards the ideals that were put together in the Constitution in the first place. And without those communities working for equality, we wouldn't have suffragette movement. We wouldn't have civil rights. We wouldn't have many of the policies that were put in place that are now in jeopardy of being revoked if we didn't have those peoples in the conversation and in the community. So very much, I think, our history is still being written, and which way it leans is going to be dependent on having folks that are been just historically and in contemporary times oppressed in the room to actually be leading those conversations, AKA Hamilton style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe we should go to questions potentially, but I'll just put a coda to what Chris said, which I found so spot on and powerful, which is, right now the city of Seattle, denizens in Seattle are being challenged by the social movements that are doing just amazing work to end policing, to reimagine safety in our communities, to disassociate legalization with safety or justice. And one of the things that the King County Equity Now and the Decriminalize Seattle movement, those two bodies together have proposed is what they're calling a people's budgetary process. So it's called participatory budgeting, where communities participate through a series of open forums leading to a large final forum on the decisions about how our monies will be apportioned. And in many ways, that what Chris was mentioning about returning to having the people who are never at the table, that is what participatory budgeting is about. And it's also about reminding us that policing is a broader process than just the police. It's a decision about where you put a playground and where you allow a private garden. It's a decision about where you allow a school and where you allow a auto shop, so that children are being poisoned by the oil that spills. So, the participatory budgeting is precisely this attempt at this moment to imagine what Chris is doing, what Chris is mentioning. And I just want to say there are all these alternatives that are really actively out there.
Thanks so much, Chris and Chandan. Yeah, we are at the point where would be happy to open up to questions. So if people who are in the Zoom room with us would like to ask any questions, you can put them in the chat, I think is how we're doing it, and I'll read them out. As we don't have any questions yet, I'm going to ask you both another question. And it sort of relates as well. It's something I thought about reading both of your pieces and also the film, or the video. It's probably a film. Is the animal trials, the trials of animals and inanimate objects. It seemed to speak to this desire for vengeance, right? Like for revenge. And I think the history of Deodand is so interesting, actually, because that's where the desire for vengeance is taken out on an inanimate object. And
do you want to just mention an example of Deodand for people who don't know it?
Yes, let me try and if I fell off my chair right now and died, the chair might be declared Deodand because it has moved to cause my death. And so then there would be a public ritual around the chair, and it would be given up to God and sort of seen as an accursed object. And then practices around Deodand changed a little, and there was sort of flexibility for the coroner to, for example, ask I think the owner of the chair to pay the value of the chair as a sort of a recompense, but it would be the chair's value that was being put into a number rather than my life. And that's because human life in a pre-industrial era was seen as too valuable to put a number on. And there's this very interesting history of where Deodand is replaced, is where railway companies, British colonialism is going ahead and railway companies are being bought. And for a train to be declared, trains were killing lots of people, and for them to be declared Deodand was very expensive. So instead now it's the human that is valued in a dollar figure. And it's totally possible to value my life right now. Like, that's, actuaries specialize in doing exactly that. So anyway, that's it, really sort of interesting concepts through law. What I was going to ask you both is about this desire for vengeance that I guess we see as medieval, but and we're probably all abolitionists here, and so as good abolitionists we shouldn't want vengeance. But I have to tell you that I do. I want revenge. And when I think about refugees languishing and setting themselves on fire on Nauru, I don't just want justice, I want revenge. And when I think about the 72 people who died in Grenfell Tower, I want revenge. And I wonder how our demands would change if we stepped it up and stopped asking for justice and demanded revenge. I don't know if you want to answer that while I quickly read these questions. Or you don't have to answer as well.
No, it's okay. Chris, do you want to answer it? Is it a form of energy for you?
That is a solid question. Particularly because if I go back to my Avatar reference, right? Hopefully y'all have seen it and I don't completely ruin the show for you, but like in the very last episode, rather than the Avatar deciding to kill this big bad foe who had wreaked havoc over the entire set of combined nations, to essentially, it was like settler colonialism, obey the way in which we live and therefore you will be prosperous. Rather than killing the antagonist, he really just takes away his power to enact so much violence and so much despair. And I like to think of that as the alternative solution that isn't being discussed in these conversations of vengeance. So, for instance, as many of you probably are already aware, it's already October 22nd, but again, crazy set of months, right? October 1st, Trump was diagnosed with COVID. Everybody in the world knew that he and his wife and several folks had COVID. And right after that, folks were looking for vengeance. They were saying, I hope he dies, right? Many folks, I don't think, really took into account the idea of like this eye for an eye mentality. Everybody ends up getting blind. So I think for all of the hurts that has been caused by institutions like that as a case study, right? Seeing the karmic output of justice actually be enacted, where they are upheld, here's the important piece, to the same standard that everybody else is held to, right? And that's where we fall flat, is like justice has been taken from the people, where it should be working for the people. So even in the analogy of how much our lives are worth, unfortunately, my life, if I was shot today on the news, may be less than Sarah's life. That's bad, right? That is the society we live in. If I were to be accosted by the police, all of the blame would be put on me for being who I am, for looking the way that I look. And that's not justice nor vengeance, right? So the want to have those people who then have perpetuated oppression be the ones that then feel that same oppression, I don't think anybody in their right mind can say that they've never felt that. right? And also that doesn't get us to that process of balance as quickly as we think we want it to. Jonathan, sorry, what do you think? I didn't mean to take up too much of that time, but
no,
yeah.
Absolutely. I'll just say very quickly that I feel incumbent as the Indian in the room to just one, clarify that that anti-colonial nonviolence was not without violence. We have this really whitewashed, and I mean in the interest of whiteness, memory of nonviolence, as if it didn't mean property damage, as if it didn't mean the burning of colonial structures. One of my favorite things of the Iranian Revolution was that they burned all of the bureaucracy's papers so that people didn't have records anymore. And I think that it's really important, that we allow, we have a vengeance against violence because we think that it means that it mars nonviolence. And what is one person's violence is actually another person's act of freedom. So I would kind of turn that around a little bit. We live in a society of vengeance, and they call it nonviolence. And the second thing I would say about vengeance is, for activists in the movement right now for Black Lives, for example, I think that those activists don't have the privilege of vengeance. We are fighting an asymmetrical state war. The state uses policing that has the powers of the American military, technologically and financially and numerically. And so we're just not going to win fighting in a war of position in that manner. And so in a way, repair is about communities that have never had the privilege of vengeance. How have communities who've never had the privilege of vengeance continue to work with their oppressors on a daily basis? That's a daily act of repair that they're doing that people who are privileged don't even know is happening around them.
Thanks so much, both. We have Alexis and Charlene, the filmmakers. I think, are you?
Yeah,
there?
hi.
Hello.
Hi,
Hey, Charlene.
this is Alexis.
Hello.
Hi,
guys.
thank you
Thanks
all
so
so
much.
much.
This is
This
very
is
nice.
really, yeah, it's like more than I think we could have ever imagined might generate from this kind of a discussion that we've been having with ourselves for many years. So I feel very humbled and kind of just in awe of listening to all of you. So thank you.
Thank you for your work. It's really crucial at this moment.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it feels crucial at this moment, but just to kind of be generating these sorts of discussions with folks, and kind of maybe as Sarah was just saying, like finding a place for a bit of the rage, I think, that exists that we sometimes don't know what to do with.
Yeah, Alexis, could I ask both of you to speak a little bit about that? I was actually thinking of it when Sarah asked about vengeance. The audience hasn't seen the film yet, but hopefully this is a plug for everyone to see it because it's amazing. But there's this great moment in the middle of the film where one feels one's blood boiling at the ridiculousness of the law. And the film kind of jumps into a musical. And there's this kind of, chipmunk voice that's the chorus or parabasis next to the musical, and it's sort of singing the violence. And I was really kind of taken by the ways that you all are kind of using these absurdist techniques to handle vengeance and these complicated feelings. And so I was just wondering if you could speak to it, your all's decisions about the mixing of genres in the film.
Sure. Do you want me to go? Do you want to go?
Well, you
We
start.
do this
I'll
every
follow.
I think, yeah, it's very much like kind of as you were speaking about, you know, obviously the first thing that kind of comes to mind when you encounter these sorts of things or these sorts of trials is absurdity, but it doesn't take very long, as you've all generated, like to get to the sort of like real crucial and upsetting and disheartening aspects of these trials, and so much of them speak to the kind of complex mess that we're all in when it comes to the law. And so I think that really like inspired a whole host of ways of trying to deal with that. Is like every time we came to like one sort of like artistic decision, so let's say like the voiceover is voiced by person type A, it would just bring up a whole sort of other questions of like, well, why, and what does it mean to have this voice, and what does it mean to tell this story and not another story, and so I think like the mixing of genre in a way was our sort of, I guess, chance to kind of get under all of those questions rather than speak in a sort of powerful voice of God kind of way. And the musical aspect was really to kind of draw out how absurd the world that we live in is truly, I mean, in a kind of very basic way. It really, I think, does it. Yeah.
We
Yeah,
kind of
that's-
also, like throughout the pace of the film, like starting somewhat muted, where it was more quiet, and then as it progressed, it built and built and built. The absurdity built, and the aesthetics kind of got a bit nutso. And so I think with that chapter where you have the musical, it felt like a bit of the break, where
Yeah.
things kind of, you know, it's almost like the climax, like things kind of reach this boiling point. And then obviously we decided to deal with the objects, because I guess in our minds, the objects on trial were perhaps more strange than any of these other things being put on trial.
Right.
And so I think that allowed us to kind of sink into a different aesthetic, but also, yeah, just to think about how wild these things can be. And then it goes into this other chapter of the rooster being put on trial, which very much borrows from like horror film techniques of like this like topsy-turvy world, very
Yes.
literally is topsy-turvy world. And then coming back to a muted place where these acts of violence can be so mundane and so simplistic. So in some way, the film, like if you think about the aesthetics of the third and the fourth chapter, which are the kind of wild chapters, I guess, it sort of creates this arc where it starts off slow, it goes high, and then it ends up a little slow again, to kind of bring you back into maybe a more contemporary moment.
Mm.
Think that not all violence and injustice is so wacky and out there, you know, it can be muted also.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. It's so nice to talk about the art, actually. But we do have a question for the panel that I'll just read out. Thinking along the lines of participatory budgeting, processes of justice, resolving matters of discord or conflict, work out in everyday activities between persons outside of spaces like the courts, for example. Are these efforts futile in learning from community about how these decisions work out as they conceive it? What are other examples like participatory budgeting? Do either of you, or Charlene or Alexis, want to? I mean, I guess I think of tenants unions. I know that the Los Angeles Tenants Union actually produces some really great resources that I use in teaching here in London. That there's now a London Renters Union that is, you know, not a union under the ordinary organizational rules of unions, but a group of tenants from across London who are demanding just housing outside the remits of what law currently provides for. And, you know, I mean, justice is certainly a process for them. It's going to be long. But I find that their work, for example, picketing real estate agents that have taken fees from tenants that are too high and unfair, and having organizing for people, in COVID times to call the office constantly so that their phones are unanswerable. I find that kind of work really inspiring and imaginative. I don't know if you guys have any other examples.
Yeah, Chris, do you want to? I'm happy to go as well.
Yeah, would you like to take the wheel first?
Sure. Yeah, I think that the examples are just limitless. I mean, as Sarah was mentioning, the tenants union, I think that the entire movement of abolition was truly laughed at by dominant power up until literally 2 years ago, but the movement was around for more than 30 years. So these things take a long time, but the persistence really does show the, it takes a long time to work through people's common sense and to help them see another world. And I think that what all of this conversation is about is, if you don't think of the law as providing justice, you're going to start seeing alternative worlds everywhere, and alternatives to the existing world everywhere. So in addition to participatory budgeting and tenants unions, the explosion of mutual aid has been another example of people figuring out ways to provide for the needs of one another without going through social services, and kind of working on one another's lives in the absence of a state that has abandoned them. So I think there's the attempts to end detention centers here in Washington State, immigrant detention centers, is a really great example. So there are kind of numerous. The other one that I would really want to mention is, the orcas and the sort of sea in general in this region is indebted to indigenous sovereignty. Without the indigenous tribes having protected waterways and demanding the uprooting of existing dams that are used for energy production to allow for the salmon numbers to go back up, the orcas would be slowly starving, and they still might become extinct. They're still on the verge, but indigenous sovereignty has really been the alternative for a lot of species and relations with species in this region in particular. So, I think that the question is really, I know there's a question about scale. I don't think it's a matter of scale. I think it's a matter of reimagining governance. Can we devolve governance such that we can actually build up these alternatives?
Yeah, and I'll briefly add that certainly I think community participation in many realms can in fact be very helpful, and even things, say for instance as small as community gardens, can be really helpful in, say, food sovereignty and the relationship to the land. So I bring that up because there's specific examples here in Seattle and Tacoma where many Black-led organizations, one being HUG, establishes these community gardens throughout the city to allow many folks that don't have access to equitable green space have the ability to have that access, to learn about the plants that they're growing, to learn about the plant and pollinator interactions and why they're so important. That is important because not only does it help society and the communities that have those gardens, but it also helps the ecology of organisms in cities. In particular, bees. And bees are really, really important. If we have the conversation about ecosystem services, especially again under the guise of justice and what justice means, right? If we use the ecological framework, then we understand that the ability for an ecosystem to thrive is in and of itself a form of justice. So if that is a form of justice, then the mechanism to achieve said justice is to make sure that there are a diversity of organisms that are making sure those mechanisms stay in place. So hence the bees, right? The bees are the workers for justice, if you will. And being able to create urban gardens gives us the freedom, the flexibility, the space to see our creativity in ways that are through the natural landscape, a way of essentially bringing us back to what was stripped from us, and that being the most important of nature, right?
Thanks so much. I think Nina is going to, yeah, hi.
Hi, thank you all so much. This sort of concludes our time together today. I mean, I feel like this could continue on for many more hours. But for today, we'll thank everybody, our panelists, our attendees, everybody for their participation today. And just so everybody is aware, today's panel was recorded, and it will be available on the Colloquium microsite, so you can share it and revisit some of the content of what we talked about today. And you can also find the written contributions that Sean and Sarah and Christopher were speaking to, as well as the script to Alexis and Charlene's film, and then come to the Henry in the new year to see the musical act that was being described. And then also please mark your calendars for the next two roundtables. On November 11th, we'll be addressing the query, what documents narrate, constrain, and liberate subjecthood, moderated by Nicole Fleetwood. And then on December 3rd, Colleen Diane moderates a conversation that addresses the question, what is the human anyway? So to continue the interconnected threads that were begun here, we'll continue across those next two roundtables. So thank you everyone so much. And we'll see you hopefully on the 11th.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.